Let's travel back to the Roman Empire, a time of amazing power and greatness, a time of emperors, gladiators, and philosophers. The Roman Empire was at its biggest when it included the British Isles in the north, the deserts of Africa in the south, and the fertile lands of Mesopotamia in the east, as well as the Iberian Peninsula in the west. This was an empire where different cultures, languages, and traditions came together under the Roman flag. It was a time of luxury and excess, of new ideas and exploration, and of cultural and intellectual growth that had a lasting impact on human civilization. Imagine the city of Rome in this era, the heart of the empire, full of life and activity. The city's impressive buildings, large public areas, and fancy houses showed how powerful and rich the empire was. Rome was a busy city with many different types of buildings. There were grand temples and opulent palaces, as well as small, crowded homes and busy marketplaces. The city was full of life. There were people selling things, children playing, and lots of people going to and from their daily activities. At the same time, the city was also a place where you could relax. There were quiet gardens and public baths where you could unwind. The people of Rome were as diverse as the city itself. There were the patricians, the wealthy aristocrats who held the highest offices and had a lot of political power. They lived in grand villas decorated with intricate designs and paintings, surrounded by beautiful gardens and looked after by many slaves. Their days were busy. They were always doing politics, public duties, eating, and having fun. Below the patricians were the plebeians, the common people of Rome. They were the foundation of the city, working as farmers, traders, craftsmen, and laborers. Even though they had a lower status, the ordinary people had their own political institutions and were very important to the functioning of the empire. Life in the Roman Empire was not just about politics and power, but was also rich in cultural and intellectual pursuits. The Romans really liked Greek culture and learning, and many of the empire's greatest thinkers and artists were heavily influenced by Greek ideas. Philosophy, literature, and the arts all thrived because the emperors and the rich were supporting them. Poets like Virgil and Horace, and philosophers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius are still read and admired today. But life in the Roman Empire was also difficult and hard. The empire was very big and had many different cultures, which made it hard to govern. There were a lot of rebellions, especially in the more distant provinces. Slavery was common, and life for the slaves was often very hard. The rich and the poor were very different, and it was hard for people to move up in society. Despite these challenges, the Roman Empire managed to stay united and stable for hundreds of years. This shows how well organized and powerful it is. But life in the Roman Empire was not just about surviving and struggling. It was also about having fun and celebrating. The Romans were known for their love of games and spectacles. The Colosseum, the largest amphitheater in the empire, was the venue for exciting gladiator fights and wild beast hunts. The Circus Maximus was a huge stadium where exciting chariot races were held. These races attracted tens of thousands of spectators. The emperors and rich people often sponsored these shows, which were important for keeping the public happy and showing the Roman way of life. Religion was another very important part of life in the Roman Empire. The Romans believed in many gods and goddesses. They believed their city and empire came from a god and performed complicated rituals and sacrifices to try and get on the god's good side. Over time, the Roman religion took on elements from the many cultures it ruled, creating a rich and varied religious landscape. As we learn more about the Roman Empire, we will look at its social structure, politics, ideas, and the daily life of the people who lived under the Roman Empire. We will also look at the reasons why the empire declined and fell, and what it taught future generations. As we learn about this exciting time in history, remember that the Roman Empire was more than just a political group. It was a lively and varied society made up of many different cultures and ideas that had a big impact on human history. On this trip back in time, we have already started to explore the greatness and complexity of life during the Roman Empire's golden age. From the luxury of the rich people's houses to the simple homes of ordinary people. From the places where people get together to talk about ideas to the busy markets. From the big shows in the Colosseum to the calm atmosphere of the public baths. The Roman Empire was a world of contrasts, a world of power and struggle, of culture and learning, and of human aspiration and achievement. As we continue this journey, let's learn from the past, appreciate what has been achieved, and marvel at its lasting legacy. As we learn more about the Roman Empire at its most powerful, let's explore the busy streets of Rome, the heart of the empire. Imagine seeing grand buildings like the Colosseum and the Pantheon that were a feature of the city's skyline. These amazing buildings show how good Rome was at engineering, and they still impress us now. The most common type of home in Rome was the insula, which was basically an apartment building. These structures were often built cheaply and could be prone to fires and collapses. But this was normal for most people in Rome because only rich people could afford their own home. These were fancy apartments with rooms arranged around a central courtyard, often decorated with detailed mosaics and paintings on the walls. In Roman society, the family was seen as the most important unit. The paterfamilias, or father of the family, had almost total power over his family. This power was called patria potestas. This power extended over his wife, children, and slaves, binding them into a single economic and legal entity. But in contrast to what many people think, Roman women were much freer than women in other ancient societies. They could own property and pass it on to their children, and they had the right to get a divorce. Slavery was a key part of the Roman economy and society. Slaves did all kinds of jobs, from cleaning and teaching to working in the fields and mines. But life as a slave was not easy. How they were treated depended on their masters. Some slaves were treated relatively well, while others suffered greatly. The Romans were famous for their engineering and public health achievements. They built a complicated network of roads and bridges to make it easier to move goods and soldiers around. Their aqueducts cleverly brought fresh water from faraway places into cities and towns. This made it possible to have public baths and toilets, keeping people clean. The Roman diet was simple but nourishing, with wheat and barley being the main ingredients. They ate a variety of fruits, vegetables, and legumes. The richer Romans could afford meat, fish, and unusual spices. The Romans were also known for their love of wine, which was drunk at all meals and social occasions. Education was very important in Roman society. The rich Romans often paid for their children to have private teachers, while the poor sent their children to public schools. The lessons were tough, with a focus on reading, writing, maths, and how to behave. Religion was a big part of everyday life in ancient Rome. The Romans worshipped many gods and goddesses, each one in charge of a different area of life. They believed that it was important to have a good relationship with the gods. They did this by performing rituals and sacrifices, a practice known as pietas. Despite its greatness, the Roman Empire had problems. There was a lot of poverty and class disparity, and it was obvious to everyone that there was a big difference between the rich and the poor in the city. People liked to watch public entertainment like gladiator games and chariot races. This was a way to stop people worrying about problems in society. If we look at Roman life as a whole, we see a society with both great achievements and big problems. The Romans built amazing buildings and had a society that worked well. This society has had a big effect on the world even today. As we close our eyes and drift off to sleep, we carry with us the echoes of this ancient world, reminding us of the human ability to create, adapt, and endure. As we learn more about the Roman Empire when it was at its most powerful, let's look at the amazing city planning and infrastructure that made the empire successful. The Romans were very organized and practical and liked luxury. They designed their cities with complicated patterns and used advanced building materials. At the center of every Roman city was the Forum, a public square that was the city's most important center for politics, business, and society. The Forum was usually built around important government buildings, temples, and markets. People would meet here to talk about politics, do business, or just to meet friends. Big cities like Rome had more than one forum, and each one was different and had its own purpose. A city's greatness was often shown by its big buildings. The most famous of these is the Colosseum in Rome. It was an engineering marvel and could hold up to 50,000 spectators. It was used for public events such as gladiator fights, sea battles, animal hunts, and executions. But not all Roman cities had grand buildings like this. Smaller towns and cities also had their own amphitheaters, but these were smaller. One of the most important features of Roman city planning was the grid system. The city's roads were arranged in a grid pattern, with the two main roads, the Cardo and the Decumanes, crossing each other at the center of the city. This layout made it easy to get around and divided the city into smaller, easier to manage areas. The streets were often lined with shops and stalls, creating a lively and busy atmosphere. But the Romans were good at more than just city planning. They were also very good at building things. Their aqueducts, for example, were amazing constructions. They used gravity to carry water from faraway places into the city. The Romans understood how important clean water was for their citizens' health, and their aqueducts, some of which are still in use today, show how clever they were. Another important thing to see is the Roman sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima. Another great engineering achievement that made the city much cleaner and healthier. It was a huge underground network that carried away waste and storm water, keeping things clean and stopping diseases spreading. Roman homes, known as domus, were equally impressive. In cities, these homes were often part of insulae, a kind of multi-story apartment building. On the ground floor, shops and businesses were usually located. The upper floors were where people lived. But richer Romans lived in separate houses with more than one room, a middle courtyard, and often their own bathrooms. Baths were not just places for cleaning, they were also important for socializing. The grand baths, like the baths of Caracalla in Rome, had lots of different facilities, including hot and cold baths, saunas, gyms, and even libraries. People could relax, exercise, or have a chat, all in the same place. The Romans were very good at planning their cities and building things like houses and public buildings. They knew how important it was to have things like cleanliness, fun things to do, and places for people to meet each other. They made sure that their cities had all these things. Their careful attention to detail, together with their advanced technology, played a big part in why people had such a good life during the Roman Empire's golden age. As we carry on our journey, we will learn more about Roman lifestyle, food, clothing, and entertainment. All of these things played a big part in creating the unique culture of this great civilization. But for now, let's appreciate the amazing planning and infrastructure that made the Roman Empire so successful. As we carry on our journey into the past, we now find ourselves in the middle of the Roman Empire, in its busy capital city, Rome. The city was a symbol of the empire's greatness, and it was possible to experience all aspects of Roman life and culture there. Rome was the perfect example of what it meant to live during the Roman Empire's golden age. As we walk through the old city, we see the famous Roman baths. These were not just places for cleaning, but also where all the Romans met to chat, do business, and relax after a busy day. These baths were like little hotels with big heated pools, steam rooms, and gyms. Some, like the baths of Caracalla, even had libraries, classrooms, and shops. The Romans were very careful about their personal hygiene, and these baths showed how important this was to them. When we leave the warm bathhouse, we are on the busy streets of Rome. The city was very busy. The streets and alleys were full of people selling things, from fresh fruit and vegetables, fish and meat, to clothes and jewelry. Slaves were busy carrying out their master's orders. There was always a lot of noise, with people talking, bargaining, and the sound of carts and chariots. Our path leads us to the Grand Forum, the center of Roman public life. You can find the great temples, the Senate House, and the markets here. The Forum was where the people of Rome met to hear important speeches, watch trials, and get involved in public affairs. The marble buildings were shiny in the sun, and this made the city look almost magical. This must have made the citizens of Rome feel very inspired. Just beyond the Forum, we find the Circus Maximus, the great stadium where Romans would go to watch the exciting chariot races. These events were very popular, and the stadium could hold up to 150,000 spectators. The air would be filled with the roar of the crowd as they cheered for their favorite charioteers, adding to the exciting atmosphere. If you go further, you will find the Colosseum, the grand amphitheater where gladiatorial contests, mock sea battles, and other public spectacles were held. Here, people from Rome would come together to watch these exciting and dramatic shows. The Colosseum could hold up to 50,000 spectators, and the emperors often sponsored these shows to make themselves more popular. As the day ends, we are in the residential areas of Rome. The rich lived in big villas with beautiful mosaics and frescoes, while the poor lived in apartment blocks or on islands. These were often small and had no basic amenities. This shows the big difference between the rich and the poor in Roman society. As the sun sets, the city is lit up by oil lamps, which make the stone buildings look warm and inviting. The streets are quieter now, but the city is still very busy. Romans like to eat, drink, and have fun together in taverns and inns. There's music and laughter everywhere, which makes the atmosphere lively. As we finish our trip around the city, it's clear that life during the Roman Empire's height was all about a lively social life, a love of art, and a strong sense of community. It was a time of great wealth and cultural growth, and the effects of this can still be seen today. In the next section, we will learn more about the daily lives of Roman citizens. We will look at what they did, what they believed, and their personal lives. We will discover how they lived, loved, and thrived in this vast empire. So, for now, close your eyes and imagine the soft glow of the Roman lamps, the sound of the city going about its nightly activities, and the distant laughter from a nearby pub. Let the sounds and sights of ancient Rome help you to relax as we get ready to set off on our next trip back in time. As we carry on our journey through the Roman Empire at its most powerful, we arrive in the busy center of the empire, the city of Rome. It is important to remember that Rome was not just the capital, but a symbol of the empire's strength, wealth, and greatness. The city was a busy place with over 1 million people living there, which was amazing for that time. Rome was a place where lots of different cultures, languages, and traditions came together. The city was also very well organized, and there was a lot of law and order. The city was an amazing feat of engineering and architecture, with impressive structures like the Colosseum, the Forum, and the Pantheon. The streets were full of people and business, with traders from all over the empire selling their goods. The sounds of the city were always there. You could hear the noise of chariots on the cobblestones and people talking in the bathhouse and taverns. The average Roman citizen's life was not very different from our own. They woke up at sunrise, had a quick breakfast, and then went about their day's work. Many Romans were business people, while others worked as craftsmen, soldiers, farmers, or slaves. Lunch was a quick meal, often eaten out, while dinner was more fancy and often shared with family and friends. Even though the city and the empire were impressive, life was hard for the average Roman citizen. The rich and the poor were very different, and there were a lot of poor people. A lot of people called Romans lived in very small apartment buildings called insulae. These buildings were often dangerous and dirty. Fire was a constant threat in these structures, and the Roman fire brigade was a vital part of the city's infrastructure. But despite these problems, Roman society was still strong and able to deal with them. The Romans were great at inventing new things. They invented lots of technologies that we take for granted today. They had a complicated system of aqueducts to bring fresh water into the city and a network of roads and bridges that connected the far-flung corners of the empire. They had public baths, gyms, and libraries. They also thought education and the arts were important. The Romans loved theater, and plays were a popular form of entertainment. People also really liked epic poetry, philosophy, and history. The great Roman writers Virgil, Horace, and Livy are still famous today. The Romans also loved sports and games. Chariot races were a popular pastime, and the Circus Maximus, the largest stadium in Rome, could hold up to 250,000 spectators. Another big attraction was the gladiator games. Although they were violent and bloody, religion was an important part of Roman life. The Romans believed in many gods and goddesses. Temples for these gods were found all over the city, and religious festivals and ceremonies were a normal part of Roman life. The emperor himself was seen as a god, and his cult was a key part of the state religion. As we finish this part of our trip through the Roman Empire, it's important to remember that Rome was more than just a city. It was a symbol. It was the heart of a huge Roman Empire that stretched across 3 continents. This shows how clever, ambitious, and strong the Roman people were. Life in Rome was a small example of life in the empire as a whole. It was filled with all the complexities, contradictions, and challenges that come with being part of one of the greatest civilizations in history. As we go along, we will look more closely at Roman society, its people, its organizations, and its culture. As the sun sets on another day during the Roman Empire's peak, we explore the culture and society of the time. The Romans, like us, wanted to have fun and do things to fill their free time. Many of these activities are still familiar to us today, with theaters, baths, and stadiums playing a big role in Roman society. The theater was a very important part of Roman culture. It was a place where people went to be entertained and to meet other people. There were all kinds of performances, from tragedies and comedies to pantomimes and mimes. Roman theaters were huge buildings with seating for thousands of people. They were often in the middle of the city, which made the city more lively. These performances were fun, but they also made people think about the problems in society at the time. The Romans liked watching gladiator fights. These were brutal affairs with gladiators often fighting to the death. Even though the games were violent, lots of people went to watch them. They were popular with people from all parts of society. The show was a strong display of Roman power and the strength of the Roman army. The emperors also used the games to win over the people. They often paid for huge shows to be put on, but it wasn't all fighting and drama. The Romans also liked the finer things in life. Baths known as thermae were a common sight in Roman cities and towns. People used to go to the beach not just to swim, but also to meet friends, do business, and exercise. The larger baths were amazing buildings with heated floors, steam rooms, and fancy mosaics. Many Romans visited the bathhouse every day. This shows that cleanliness and hygiene were very important to them. Roman food, was another interesting part of their culture. It was varied and sophisticated. The food that Roman citizens ate was very different depending on their social class. The rich Romans liked to have big meals with lots of different, unusual foods. These banquets were often elaborate affairs that lasted several hours and included entertainment. The diet of the average Roman citizen was more simple. They ate grains, fruits, vegetables, and sometimes meat. The social structure of the Roman Empire was rigid, with a clear distinction between the aristocratic elite and the common citizens. The emperors and the senatorial class were at the top. The equestrians and the plebeians were below them. Slaves were seen as property and not as citizens, so they were at the bottom of the social order. Despite these social divisions, there was a degree of social mobility within Roman society. People could rise through the ranks in different ways, like through military service, making money, or getting into politics. Many people outside the Roman Empire found it attractive because they could get ahead socially there and even become citizens. Education was very important in Roman society. Children from rich families often had private teachers who taught them literature, history, and philosophy. But children from poor families often didn't get the chance to go to school. No matter what social class they were from, people thought education was very important for preparing young Romans to be good citizens and leaders. Religion was very important in Roman society, with lots of different gods and goddesses being worshipped. Temples for these gods were found all over the empire. They were used for religious ceremonies and festivals. The Roman calendar was full of religious celebrations, showing how important religion was in people's lives. The more we learn about the Romans, the more we see that their society is both familiar and strange to us. Their customs, traditions, and daily routines show what life was like in a civilization that, despite its eventual decline, has left an enduring legacy on the world. As the night draws in, let's take a moment to appreciate the complexity and richness of Roman life during the peak of the empire. Tomorrow, we will carry on exploring the politics and the army of a powerful Roman city. But for now, let's close our eyes and imagine what it was like in the grand old days of Rome. As we explore life during the Roman Empire, we move from the busy streets and grand public spaces to the private homes of the people. The home, or domus, was a very important part of Roman society, and we can learn a lot about what daily life was like in that time. Roman homes were very different depending on how rich and important their owners were. The rich lived in big, fancy houses with detailed mosaics and frescoes on the walls. The poor lived in small, multi-story apartment buildings called insulae. The Roman home of the rich was a very impressive building. The typical deuce was made up of a number of rooms. These included a dining room, a triclinium, a room with 3 sides, bedrooms, a cubicle, a kitchen, and a study or office called a tablinum. At the center of the domus was the atrium, a large open space with an opening in the roof that allowed rainwater to collect in a shallow pool below. This pool is called the impluvium. This clever design let in natural light and fresh air, while also being useful. The walls of these homes often had pictures on them. These pictures were called frescoes. They showed scenes from stories about gods and heroes or everyday life. The floors were often covered in mosaics made up of tiny colored tiles. The pictures on the mosaics range from simple shapes to complex scenes from stories about gods and heroes, history, and the natural world. These decorative elements were more than just for looks. They were a way for the homeowner to show how well off they were, how well-read they were, and how well-educated they were. The Roman Due was also a place of work. Many rich Romans had shops or offices attached to their homes, where they did their business. Slaves did most of the work, like running a shop, cooking meals, and cleaning the home. The treatment of slaves was different in many cases. but in many cases, they were considered part of the family and were treated with respect. The dos were big, multi-story apartment buildings. The insulae were small, crowded apartment buildings. The insulae housed the city's lower classes. These buildings were often badly built and often caught fire or collapsed. The apartments were small and cramped, often with a single room that served as both a living and sleeping area. Even though things were hard, the insulae were lively places full of life and activity. Food and dining were very important parts of Roman life. The meals of the lower classes were simple. They often consisted of grain, vegetables, and sometimes meat or fish. The rich people had big parties to show how well off they were. A typical banquet might include a range of dishes from oysters to peacock, accompanied by fine wines, and followed by entertainment such as music, dancing, or poetry readings. Education was very important in Roman society. Kids learnt at home with their parents or private teachers until they were 7. Then they started going to school. Boys and girls were educated separately. Boys learned to read and write and did maths. Girls learned to spin, weave, and do other household chores. Religion was a big part of everyday life in ancient Rome. From the public rituals held in temples and during public games to the private ceremonies held in people's homes. Each home had a small shrine where the household gods were worshipped. People believed that these gods or spirits would protect their home and its inhabitants. In the next section, we will explore Roman entertainment, like gladiator fights and chariot races. These are popular and gave people a break from their daily lives. As we carry on exploring the Roman Empire, picture yourself walking through the streets of Rome. Imagine what it was like to live in a grand villa owned by a wealthy person, or in a busy market where people from all walks of life came together. Try to picture the sights, sounds, and smells of this remarkable period in history. As we carry on exploring life during the Roman Empire's golden age, we're now going to take a look at the political system and the army that made this historical superpower what it was. At the center of the Roman political system was the Senate, a group of Rome's most respected citizens who gave advice to the government. The Senate had a lot of power over the Roman state and was made up of members who served for life, usually former magistrates. The Senate was not only a political body, but also a social institution, a sort of gentleman's club where the elite could discuss matters of state and society. The main job of the Senate was to advise the magistrates and the people. But the decisions it made, called anitus consultor, were important. The Roman Empire was a time when one person, the emperor, had all the power. But it was important to keep up the idea of the republic, and so the emperors did everything they could to get the Senate's approval. The emperor would suggest new laws, which the Senate would then agree to. The Senate couldn't really oppose the emperor, but by endorsing his decisions, they made them seem more legitimate. The emperor couldn't rule on his own, and the imperial court was made up of a lot of officials, advisors, and family members. The emperor's household, known as the domus, was the administrative center of the empire. In this situation, the emperor had a lot of people around him who could help him rule. These people included advisors, freedmen, slaves, and family members. The court was full of conspiracy as different groups tried to win the emperor's favor. The Roman Empire was more than just a political entity. It was also a huge military machine. The Romans had a professional army, the first of its kind in history. The legions were the backbone of the army. These were units of about 5,000 men, further divided into centuries of around 80 men. The legions were not just fighting forces. They were also engineering corps, building roads, bridges, and fortifications across the empire. Each legion was made up of different groups of soldiers. Each group had its own leader, its own medical staff, its own engineers, and even its own small navy. The soldiers were well trained and disciplined, with a strict chain of command and a code of conduct. The legions were not just for war. They also served as a police force, keeping order in the provinces. The Roman military was successful because it was able to adapt. The Romans often used the tactics and weapons of the enemies they defeated. They then made their own military plans based on these. The Roman army was a formidable force because it was adaptable, disciplined, and well-organized. The Roman navy also played a very important role in the empire spreading further. It was responsible for protecting the sea routes that were vital for trade and communication. The navy was not as well respected as the legions, but it was very important for keeping the empire safe and successful. Life in the Roman army was hard, but you could get promoted. Many people from the countryside wanted to join the army or the navy to become citizens. Soldiers were rewarded with land, money, and the chance to move up in society. As we look more closely at the politics and the army of the Roman Empire, we see a system of checks and balances, a complicated web of relationships, and an army that was both innovative and efficient. All of these things together created an empire that lasted for hundreds of years and had a big impact on the world. As we move on from the political and military parts of Roman life, the next section will look at the cultural and social parts of the Roman Empire. We will look at the daily lives of its citizens from different social classes. There is still so much to discover about this amazing time in human history. As we learn more about the Roman Empire at its peak, it becomes clearer that the Romans lived in a world that was similar to and different from our own. Let's see what an average Roman citizen's life was like in the 2nd century AD, when the Roman Empire was at its most powerful. Romans woke up with the sun, often to the sounds of the busy city streets. As the sun started to rise, Rome would already be starting to wake up. You could hear the sounds of people setting up stalls, horses and carts on the stone streets, and blacksmiths hammering away. Most Romans lived in small apartments or houses, often sharing their space with extended family or lodgers. These houses were usually made of brick and concrete, with a flat roof that could be used for more living space or a small garden. Breakfast in Rome was simple. Most Romans would start their day with a meal of bread, cheese, and maybe olives or dried fruit. This would be drunk with a cup of pusca, a sour wine mixed with water, which was a common drink throughout the empire. After breakfast, the men would usually head off to work or to the forum, while the women would stay at home to do the housework. The Roman workday was fairly short by today's standards, often ending in the early afternoon. This was partly because of the hot Mediterranean climate, which made it difficult to work during the hottest part of the day. After work, many Romans would go to the baths, which were a key part of Roman social life. These weren't just places to get clean, but were also spaces for socializing, exercising, and even conducting business. Roman baths were grand, elaborate buildings, often featuring a series of heated rooms and pools. People would usually start in thearium, a warm room that opened the pores, before moving to the hotter caldarium. After exercising in the heat, they would jump into the cold waters of the frigidarium. Many baths also had gymnasiums, libraries, and even barber shops. The Romans took their bathing very seriously. They saw it as both a social duty and a sign of civilization. After their visit to the baths, Romans would return home for cena, the main meal of the day. This was a relaxed event, often lasting several hours, where a variety of dishes were served. A typical Roman cena might include a starter of eggs or a salad, followed by a main course of meat or fish, and finished with a dessert of fruit or honeyed cakes. Wine was often served with the meal, but it was usually watered down. In Rome, people relaxed and went out to enjoy themselves in the evening. Many Romans would go to the theater or watch gladiator fights at the Colosseum. Others might visit a pub for a drink and a bit of gambling, or enjoy a leisurely walk around the city. When it got dark, the streets of Rome would be lit by oil lamps, which cast a warm, flickering glow over the city. Although there are many similarities to our own lives, it's important to remember that life in the Roman Empire was also marked by significant inequalities. Slavery was a key part of Roman society, and the lives of slaves were often very hard. The rich and powerful Romans lived in such luxury that it is hard to imagine what life was really like. They ate food from faraway countries and wore clothes made of the best silk. As we finish this part of our trip through the Roman Empire, we remember how complicated and different this ancient civilization was. Rome was a city of contrasts, where grand buildings and squalid slums existed side by side. It was a place where normal life and magic were mixed together, creating a society that still interests us even after more than 2,000 years. In the next sections, we will learn more about Roman society and this exciting period in history. As we carry on exploring the Roman Empire, let's take a look at what people's lives were like during the Pax Romana, which is a time of peace and stability from 27 BC to 180 AD. This era was a time of significant growth and prosperity. The empire grew from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, Spain in the west, and Mesopotamia in the east. The center of the empire was the city of Rome, a busy city of over 1 million people. The people living there were a mix of different cultures, including Romans, Greeks, Jews, Gauls, Germans, Britons, Thyians, Egyptians, and many others from all over the empire. Rome was the center of trade, politics, and culture. It had amazing public buildings and beautiful, fancy homes that showed how rich and powerful the empire was. Roman society was organized on a strict hierarchical system. The most powerful people in society were the senators. These were the members of the oldest and richest families in Rome. They had the most political power. Below them were the rich businessmen and professionals who rode horses. Most people were ordinary citizens who could vote, but had little political power. The slaves were at the bottom of the pile. They had no rights and were considered property. Life in Rome was a mix of work, fun, and getting involved in public life. Most Romans worked 6 days a week, with businesses and shops opening early in the morning and closing in the afternoon. Many Romans were traders, artisans, or farmers, though some were teachers, doctors, or civil servants. Slaves did most of the hard physical work, from building houses to rowing ships, and even doing the cleaning. Despite working long hours, Romans also knew how to enjoy life. Public baths were a popular place for people to socialize after work. Romans could relax there, play games, and discuss politics. The Romans loved their games. From board games like tabula, which was similar to backgammon, to physical activities like wrestling and horse racing, the most popular spectator sport was the gladiatorial games. These involved trained fighters battling each other or wild animals in front of large crowds who were cheering. Food was another important part of Roman life. Most Romans ate 3 meals a day: a light breakfast, a main meal at midday, and a light dinner in the evening. The typical Roman diet was mainly made up of cereals, bread, cheese, fruit, and vegetables, and sometimes meat. The rich people ate lots of different foods, including unusual dishes, good wines, and sweet desserts. Education was very important in Roman society. Wealthy families often paid tutors to teach their children at home, while poorer families sent their children to school. Boys and girls both received basic education, but most of them were boys who went on to receive higher education. The subjects taught included reading, writing, arithmetic, music, and rhetoric. Rhetoric was particularly important for people who wanted a career in politics. Religion was a big part of Roman life. Every home had a small shrine to the household gods. The Romans honored many different gods and goddesses, each one in charge of a different aspect of life. Temples were common in Rome, and religious festivals, sacrifices, and processions were a regular event. The Romans also believed in divination and asked soothsayers for guidance on important decisions. When we learn about daily life during the Pax Romana, we can understand the Romans' complex society and culture better. Tune in for the next part of our series as we delve deeper into the political and military systems of the Roman Empire and the amazing engineering achievements that still impress us today. As you drift off to sleep, imagine the busy streets of Rome, the crowds cheering in the Colosseum, and the soft sound of prayers in the temples. Let the sounds of this ancient civilization help you to relax and sleep. As we learn more about the Roman Empire, we now look at the society that made it great. Roman society was very hierarchical. It was divided into three groups: the aristocratic patricians, the common people, the plebeians, and the slaves. The patricians were the top group in Roman society. They were the rich people who owned land and the people in charge of running the country. They lived in big, fancy houses, often on hills that looked over the city. They enjoyed a life of leisure and luxury. They would spend their days in the forum discussing politics, going to religious festivals, or watching gladiator fights. The patricians were also the ones who held important positions in the government, including the role of consul, the most important elected position in the Roman Republic. The plebeians were the common people of Rome. They were very different from the patricians. They were farmers, tradesmen, soldiers, and laborers. Even though they made up most of the population, they had little political power and often had to accept the decisions made by the patricians. But over time, ordinary people managed to win some rights and privileges, including the right to elect representatives called tribunes, who could stop the actions of the consuls. But even though things were improving, life was still hard for most people. They worked long hours and didn't have much time for fun. But it's important to remember that the line between ordinary people and the upper class wasn't always clear. Many ordinary people were able to become rich and important through their work in trade or the military. These new men, as they were called, often tried to live like the patricians, building large houses and paying for public games and festivals. Slavery was a big part of Roman society and the economy. Slaves were used for all kinds of work, from farming to doing chores around the house. They could be bought and sold at markets, and their masters often treated them very badly. But some slaves were able to earn their freedom. Slaves who were free could become citizens, but they did not have many rights. The Romans had a special way of thinking about money and status. Unlike many other societies, they did not think that being rich was the same as being good. Instead, they had a concept called dignitas, which can be translated as dignity or prestige. This was a way to measure a person's influence, reputation, and standing in society. There are three ways to make yourself more important. You can serve in the military, hold public office, or sponsor public works. The Romans loved a good show. The Colosseum, where gladiators fought, was the most famous example of this. These games, often sponsored by rich noblemen, would draw crowds of tens of thousands. Gladiators, who were often slaves or criminals, would fight to the death for the entertainment of the crowd. The Romans also loved theater, and plays were often performed at festivals and religious ceremonies. Religion was a very important part of Roman society and was a big part of everything people did. The Romans worshipped many gods and goddesses, each with their own role. Religious festivals were a common occurrence, and they often involved sacrifices, prayers, and processions. The Romans believed that by honoring the gods in these ways, they could ensure their favor and protection. Education was very important in Roman society. People thought that education was the key to improving your status. Richer Romans would pay teachers to teach their children reading, writing, maths, and classical subjects. The aim of education was not only to teach people, but also to encourage the values and virtues that were important to Roman society. To sum up, during the Roman Empire's height, society was split into different classes. People loved a good show and drama. They deeply respected the gods, and education was a big deal. Even though many people had a hard time, it was a society with a rich culture and a strong sense of dignity and honor. It's easy to see how this complex and vibrant society was able to dominate the ancient world for so many centuries. In the last sections, we talked about how the Roman Empire started, how it was organized politically, and what daily life was like for its citizens. In this section, we will look at the social structure and the dynamics of Roman society during its peak. The Roman Empire, like any other ancient civilization, had a very clear social hierarchy. The patricians were the aristocrats, the ruling class, and they had most of the political power. They were the descendants of the original senators of Rome, who were chosen by Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome. Patrician families had many advantages, including the exclusive right to hold certain important positions, such as consul and senator. They were rich because they owned big pieces of land, or latifundia, where slaves or tenant farmers worked. Below the patricians were the equestrians, also known as the equites or the knight class. At first, this group was made up of people who could afford to buy a horse for the army. But over time, it changed and became a group of rich business people. They were involved in different business activities, like collecting taxes. They also often worked as public contractors. Their economic power eventually allowed them to have a lot of political influence, even though they did not have the same formal political rights as the patricians. The largest group was made up of plebeians, free Roman citizens who were not part of the patrician or equestrian classes. They were the craftspeople, shopkeepers, farmers, and workers who were the foundation of the Roman economy. They were allowed to vote, but at first they couldn't hold more important political jobs. But the people, who were called plebeians, fought back together and protested. This was called the conflict of the orders. The plebeians won some political concessions, which included the right to hold the consulship and the establishment of tribunes, who were officials elected to protect their interests. The slaves and the freedmen were at the very bottom of the social pyramid. Slavery was a key part of Roman society. Slaves did many different jobs, from doing household chores to fighting in gladiator fights. It's important to note that Roman slavery was not based on race. It was based on capture in war, punishment for crime, or the inability to pay debts. Freedmen, on the other hand, were former slaves who had either bought their freedom or had been given it by their masters. Although freedmen had most of the rights of Roman citizens, freeborn citizens did not see them as equal. The social structure of Rome also had a gendered aspect. While men dominated public life, women in Rome were relatively free and had some money of their own, which was unusual in the ancient world. They could own property, run a business, and get a divorce. But they weren't allowed to vote or hold public office. The Roman Empire was also known for its multiculturalism. As the Roman Empire grew, it absorbed many different cultures, languages, and religions. The Romans were a culturally diverse people. This was clear in all parts of their lives, from what they ate and wore to their religious beliefs and art. During the Roman Empire's height, social mobility was possible to some extent. A normal person could become rich and join the group of horse riders. A slave could be set free and become a rich businessman. And a person who liked horse riding could become a senator if they owned property. But these were rare cases. Most people stayed in the social class they were born into. Overall, Roman society during the peak of the empire was a complex and divided system that gave different levels of privilege and power to its members. Despite its inequalities, it also offered opportunities for advancement that were rare in the ancient world. In the next section, we will explore the Roman Empire's military structure and the reasons for its success. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and imagine you're a Roman soldier. As the sun set, the city of Rome would transform into a lively nighttime city. Street vendors would close their stalls. After working in the fields, laborers would return to the city. The city's many taverns and bathhouses would begin to light up. Their warm glow would cast shadows on the cobbled streets. The most famous of these buildings was the Roman baths of Caracalla. Built in the 3rd century AD, this impressive bathhouse was much more than just a place to bathe and socialize. It was a leisure center with many different functions, including libraries, gardens, and a gymnasium. People visiting the museum would start in the apothecarium, which is a changing room with wooden lockers. Next, they would go to the tepidarium, a room that is neither too hot nor too cold. There, they would start to sweat to get rid of the bad stuff in their bodies. Then they would move on to the colarium, a hot bath, and finally the frigidarium, a cold pool designed to close the pores and invigorate the body. This ritual promoted hygiene, relaxation, and friendship among the people who attended. These people included politicians, poets, generals, and gladiators. After a visit to the bathhouse, Romans might go to a banquet, another important part of social life in the empire. These events were very fancy, with guests relaxing on couches and eating delicious food like roasted peacock and stuffed dormice. The wealthier the host, the more extravagant the feast, and some aristocrats even hired professional entertainers to amuse their guests. These events often included music, poetry, and acrobatic performances. But life in the Roman Empire was not all fun and games. But there was also a darker side to the society, one that was characterized by inequality and brutality. While the rich enjoyed nice villas and banquets, the poor lived in very poor conditions, often in very crowded multi-story apartment buildings, known as insulae. These buildings often had problems like being likely to collapse and have fires, and the people living in them often didn't have basic things like running water or toilets. The empire was built on the backs of slaves who did all kinds of work, from hard physical labor in the fields to cleaning and cooking for the rich. Slaves were seen as property and were often treated very badly. The only way they could be free was if their master chose to free them. Despite these challenges, the Roman Empire was a very stable society with a strong legal system and good administration. The Romans were good at engineering. They built lots of roads and aqueducts, water pipes, to help trade and communication across the empire. There were also architects who invented new things. They were the first to use concrete and the arch. This allowed them to build amazing structures like the Colosseum and the Pantheon. The Romans were also known for their books and art. Poets like Virgil and Ovid wrote long, famous poems that are still studied today, while sculptors made realistic portraits of emperors and gods. Everyday objects like pottery and jewelry were often decorated with intricate detail. This shows that the Romans liked beauty and craftsmanship. Life during the Roman Empire was full of contrasts. It was a time of huge wealth and power, but also of poverty and people being treated badly. It was a society that thought education and culture were important, but that also liked big shows and going too far. The empire fell, but its influence can still be seen today in our architecture, legal system, language, and culture. As we carry on exploring this exciting time in history, we will learn more about the people who lived then, looking at what they did for fun, what they believed, and how they lived. We will also look at the reasons why the empire fell, which led to the Middle Ages and changed Western history forever. Until then, relax and picture the amazing sights of Rome, a former empire that, in many ways, is still around today. As we learn more about the Roman Empire at its most powerful, it's important to look at what daily life was like, especially in the busy city of Rome. To really get into the spirit of the time, let's picture what a typical day was like for an ordinary Roman person. The Roman day, known as dies, began at sunrise around 6 a.m. and ended at sunset. Their day was divided into 12-hour periods. But since the length of daylight changes with the seasons, the length of these hours was not fixed. This made their idea of time more flexible and different from our own. The daily life of a Roman citizen was dictated by their social status. The rich and powerful members of the patrician class would start their day with a small meal, known as the ataculum. This meal would usually consist of bread, cheese, and sometimes olives or dried fruits. Next, there was the morning salutation, when clients paid their respects to their patron. This was a very important part of the relationship between patrons and clients, which was a basic social dynamic of Roman society. The clients, who were often from lower-class backgrounds, provided services and support to their patron in exchange for protection and help. If our imagined Roman citizen was a plebeian or commoner, their day-to-day life would be very different. After a light meal, they would head to work. Many of them were farmers, laborers, or tradesmen, while others worked in the homes of rich Romans. The busy Roman markets, or mela, were full of stalls selling lots of different things like fruits and vegetables, fish and meat, and fabrics and jewelry. The markets were very busy. You could hear people bargaining, the smell of fresh fruit and vegetables, and see Romans of all types meeting each other. At around midday, the Romans stopped for their lunch or pandium. This was a quick meal, as it was often cold in the Mediterranean climate. After that, work continued until late afternoon. For the rich, this could mean getting involved in politics, managing their money, or running their businesses. For the smart people who studied philosophy or literature, the less fortunate continued working hard, whether that was working in the fields, making things, or working in someone's house. In the late afternoon, around 3 p.m., Romans would visit the public baths. These were not just places for hygiene, but places where people could meet friends, exercise, and even conduct business. The baths were an amazing architectural achievement of the Roman Empire. They had hot and cold pools, steam rooms, and gyms. All Roman citizens, no matter how important they were, would have spent a lot of time here because it was a key part of their daily lives. As evening approached, the main meal of the day was served. For the rich, this was often a big, fancy event with lots of different foods, like oysters and peacock tongues. For the average Roman, cena was simpler, usually consisting of a dish made from grains, vegetables, and sometimes meat or fish. After cena, there was a party where people drank alcohol. This was the end of the day. The rich people often had big parties in their fancy homes, while the poor people might meet at a local pub. As the wine flowed, Romans would chat, play games, and enjoy entertainment like music or shows. When we think about what life was like for a Roman citizen, it's important to remember that while the Roman Empire was a society of great wealth and advancement, it was also a society of stark contrasts. The rich were very wealthy, but the poor were very poor. The public buildings were grand, but the people's homes were simple. But no matter what their status was, all Romans shared the same way of life, with the same culture and identity. They were all part of one of the most important civilizations in history. This is a look at what a day in the life of a Roman citizen was like. It shows us how complicated life was during the Roman Empire. As we continue our journey, we will learn more about the society, culture, and history of this amazing civilization. As we learn more about the Roman Empire at its most powerful, we imagine ourselves walking through the busy streets of Rome, a city that was very successful financially and culturally. People from outside were attracted to Rome because of its amazing architecture and the chance to experience a new life full of opportunities and adventures. During this time, the city was more than just a place. It was a powerful symbol of strength, culture, and greatness. Try to imagine what it would have been like to be a Roman citizen in the first 2 centuries AD. As the sun comes up You will hear the quiet sound of the city waking up. The smell of fresh bread comes from the bakeries. The clang of metal from blacksmith shops echoes through the narrow alleyways. The noise of traders and merchants fills the air with a lively energy. As you walk out onto the stone streets, you can see all kinds of people going about their daily lives. Most of the Roman population were artisans, laborers, and small-time merchants. They were very important for the Roman economy and made a big contribution to its success. The middle class, or the equestrians, were successful business owners and government officials. Then there were the patricians. These were the upper class of society. They were large landowners and held important political positions. Education was very important in Roman society. Wealthy families paid for a private tutor to come to their home or sent their children to a special school where they were taught grammar, rhetoric, the study of language and speech, philosophy, the study of ideas and thoughts, and physical education. But people without much money did not have much access to education. They often only know what they have learned from their parents or from working with a master to learn a trade. Despite the differences between social classes, Roman society was united by a love of entertainment and leisure. Public baths were popular places where all types of Romans could relax, exercise, and talk about ideas. The amphitheaters, like the Colosseum, were also places where a variety of public spectacles were held. From fighting games to shows, the Roman diet was simple but healthy, with foods like wheat, olive oil, and wine. Rich Romans had the luxury of enjoying fancy meals with lots of different meats, seafood, fruits, and desserts. The poor people survived on a simple diet of porridge, bread, and sometimes a little meat or fish. The Roman Empire was famous for its advanced legal system, which set many of the rules that are still used in modern law. The law was important in all parts of Roman life, including property rights in criminal cases. It was administered by a complicated system of officials and courts, with the emperor at the top acting as the supreme judge. The Romans believed in many gods and goddesses, each one in charge of a different aspect of life. They thought that if they had a good relationship with the gods, they would have peace and prosperity. People showed this belief through various rituals, sacrifices, and public festivals. When we look back at this picture of a day in the life of a Roman citizen, we realize how varied the empire was, how well organized it was, and how full of energy it was. The Roman Empire was a time when the Roman people were very powerful and expanded their territory. It was also a time of great human experiences and social progress. We can still see the results of this in the modern world. In the next section, we will explore the complex political situation of this great empire. But for now, let your thoughts drift through the grand streets of Rome as you drift into a peaceful slumber. As we carry on our journey into the Roman Empire at its most powerful, we look at the details of Roman politics and the Roman army. The Roman Empire was a complex structure of governance that was a blend of autocracy and democracy. The emperor had complete power, but the republic was kept in name only. The Senate still had legislative and advisory roles. The Roman political system was a mix of three different types of government: monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. This was a combination that was not seen at that time. Although the emperor was the supreme ruler, the Senate, which was made up of aristocrats, played a significant role in the governance of the empire. The Senate was an important part of the Roman Republic and had a lot of influence, which kept the emperor from being too powerful. The emperor chose the senators, and they kept their position for life unless they were removed for misbehaving. The Senate's main jobs were to make new laws, control the country's money, and make sure justice was done. The political structure of the Roman Empire was complicated, but its military strength was simple. It was the best army of its time. The Roman army was very well organized, disciplined, and efficient. It was divided into legions, with each legion having about 5,000 soldiers. The legions were further divided into centuries, with each century having its own centurion. In the Roman army, promotions were based on courage and competence, not on social status. The military strength of Rome was not just because of how well organized and disciplined its army was. The Romans were also inventive in their military technology. They invented the pilum, a type of spear that bends when it hits something so the enemy cannot throw it back. The Romans also built roads and bridges so that their soldiers and supplies could move quickly. The Roman Empire was not just a military and political powerhouse. It was also an important place for culture and learning. Roman literature, art, architecture, and philosophy still influence our world today. The Romans were great supporters of the arts. Emperors often had grand architectural projects built, such as the Colosseum, the Pantheon, and the Baths of Caracalla, to show how rich and powerful they were. Roman literature was rich and varied, with works ranging from epic poems to philosophical treatises. People still study and admire Virgil, Ovid, Horace, and Seneca's works today. The philosophy of ancient Rome, especially Stoicism, had a big effect on the empire. The Stoics believed that being good and wise was important. They taught that we should always try to be calm and peaceful, no matter what is going on around us. The Roman legal system was the best example of Roman culture, politics, and military might. Roman law was a very advanced system of laws, principles, and court decisions. It was based on the principles of justice and the rule of law. The Romans created a legal system that was designed to be fair and just, and it was used as the foundation for many modern legal systems. When we think about the Roman Empire, we must also think about its good and bad points. There is a big difference between the rich and the poor, with a small group of very rich people having a lot of money, while most people had very little. Slavery was common, with many people being slaves. Despite these problems, the Roman Empire is still one of the most important civilizations in human history. As you drift off to sleep, imagine the busy streets of Rome with its grand buildings, busy markets, and lively forums. Picture the senators debating in the Senate House, the soldiers training in the military camps, and the philosophers discussing the nature of life in the public squares. The Roman Empire was a truly remarkable achievement of human civilization. As we continue our exploration, let the echoes of the past make you feel calm and sleepy, and let your dreams be full of marble columns, quiet fountains, and the eternal city at the heart of an empire. As we carry on exploring the Roman Empire, we now look at its economy and trade. Rome's economy was complicated and had many parts. It was connected to their politics and culture. It was strong because it had good farming, trade, and slave labor. The Roman Empire was huge and covered 3 continents. It brought lots of different trade goods and opportunities. The most important industry in Rome was farming. Most people in Rome were farmers. Everyone had a stake in the harvest, from the rich landowners to the poor people who worked the land. The main crop was grain, especially wheat, but there were also a lot of vineyards and olive groves. The rich soil and mild climate of Italy made it an ideal place for farming. They produced food not just for their own people, but also to sell to other parts of the empire. Rome's large amount of extra food was one of the most important things that let it look after its huge population and army. Trade was another important part of the Roman economy. Rome was an important trading city, with goods coming from all over the empire. The Mediterranean Sea, also known as the Roman Lake, was the main route for this trade. Ships carrying grain from Egypt, spices from the east, and tin for Britain would arrive at the busy ports of Rome. The city's markets sold lots of different goods from all over the world. This shows how powerful the empire was. Local craftspeople also played a part in the trade. They produced goods such as pottery, textiles, and metalwork. These were then exported across the empire. When talking about the Roman economy, you have to talk about slave labor. Slavery was a key part of Roman society and the economy. Slaves worked in all areas from farming to making things by hand. They even worked in the homes of rich people. They were bought and sold in markets, and their work helped make Rome rich and successful. The treatment of slaves was different, but their lives were often harsh and difficult. Despite the prosperity and abundance, the Roman economy also had its share of problems. Inflation was a common problem. This was because the empire was always fighting wars, and this made the money worth less. The rich and the poor were very different from each other, and most of the money was in the hands of a small group of people. This divide between rich and poor would eventually lead to the empire's downfall. But when it was at its most powerful, the Roman Empire showed how important it was to have a good system for running the economy and for trading. It was amazing that it was able to use all the resources from a huge area and put them all together into one economy. The economic system of ancient Rome has had a long-lasting impact on the modern world. You can still see the effects of Roman economic practices in today's economies and trade. So, relax and think about the busy Roman markets full of goods from other countries. Imagine the wheat fields under the hot Mediterranean sun and the sound of coins being exchanged. The Roman economy was a complex system, but one that powered the empire and had a big impact on the world. As you drift closer to sleep, let the sounds of this ancient world lull you into peaceful dreams. Tomorrow, we will learn more about what life was like during the Roman Empire's golden age. Good night. As we carry on learning about life during the Roman Empire, we now look at how people enjoyed themselves and the arts. This was a time when Rome was at the height of its cultural and artistic achievements. The city was also home to many artists, writers, and performers from all over the empire. The theater was one of the most popular forms of entertainment during this time. There were lots of different plays, from serious to funny. The actors in these plays were often slaves or freedmen, and they wore masks that could be made to look very different to show different characters. The Romans also enjoyed pantomime, a type of performance where a single dancer tells a story through movement while a group of singers or actors say the words for them. Although there were no permanent theaters in the early days of the empire, the Romans had a strong tradition of dramatic performances. Sometimes, temporary stages were built for specific festivals or events. The Romans loved to show, too, and nothing showed this better than the gladiator games. These games were often held in the grand amphitheaters that were built all over the empire. They were a chance for the Romans to show how rich and powerful they were. They organized all kinds of events, from chariot races to animal hunts. But the most famous were the fights between gladiators. These were usually slaves or criminals who were trained to fight for the entertainment of the crowd. These contests were brutal, but they were also very popular. The best gladiators could become famous and rich. This was something that was not possible for people of their social class. Music was another important part of Roman life. It was used in many different situations, like religious ceremonies and public parades. The Romans had lots of different musical instruments, including the lyre, the flute, and the tuba, a long trumpet-like instrument. Singing was also popular, and many Roman poems were written to be sung. The Romans also developed a way to write down their music, but sadly very few examples of this have survived to the present day. The Romans were very good at realism and liked to show the world as they saw it. You can see this in their sculptures, which often looked very realistic, with detailed features and expressions. They were also very good at making detailed mosaics and frescoes. These pictures showed scenes from everyday life, mythology, and history. These works were often used to decorate public buildings and private homes. and they give us a fascinating insight into the world of the Romans. The Romans were also very good at literature. The empire was home to a number of great writers, including poets like Virgil and Ovid, historians like Tacitus and Livy, and philosophers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. These works looked at lots of different topics like history, philosophy, love, and mythology. They have had a really big effect on Western literature. Education was also very important in Roman society, and there was a strong emphasis on learning and intellectual pursuits. Children were taught to read and write. They also studied maths, music, and philosophy. Education was seen as a way to prepare children for their roles in society as adults. It was also a way of teaching them the Roman Empire's values and beliefs. Even though the Roman Empire had a lot of successes, it's important to remember that life during this time was difficult for many people. The society was very divided into different classes, with a big gap between the rich and the poor. Slavery was common, and many people lived in very difficult conditions. But if you could deal with all the problems of Roman society, you could also become rich and powerful and learn a lot. As we continue to explore the Roman Empire, we will look more closely at the different parts of Roman society, including politics, the economy, and society. This will help us understand why the Roman Empire was so successful. We will also explore the reasons why the empire declined, to show that even the most powerful empires can fall. For now, picture what Roman life was like. It shows that the Romans were very clever, creative, and strong, and that their influence on history was very important. Now, as we stop exploring for the night, let the calm sounds and sights of Roman life help you to sleep. We continue to explore the Roman Empire, looking at what daily life was like at its most powerful. This was a time when a lot of new land was taken over. There was more or less peace, and important steps forward were made in culture. Picture the busy streets of ancient Rome, the center of the empire, full of people from all parts of society, from rich senators to poor slaves. The Roman Empire was a place where many different cultures came together. This made it a very interesting place to live, and it also had a big effect on the history of the world. Let's start our exploration with the typical Roman home, or dos. The Romans were very clever and built multi-story residences. For the rich, these homes were often very big and fancy, with detailed mosaics, frescoes, and statues. The atrium, a courtyard, was at the center of the domus. It often had a basin to collect rainwater. This was called the impluvium. This open space, with its play of light and shadow, was the heart of the Roman home. It was a place for socializing, conducting business, and even religious ceremonies. But not all Romans had this kind of luxury at home. Most people, especially in Rome, lived in insulae, which were multi-story apartment buildings. These buildings were sometimes 6 or 7 stories high and very small. They also did not have the same facilities as the dos. The lower floors were usually where the richer people lived because they were sturdier and less likely to catch fire. The higher floors were where the poorer people lived because they were more dangerous. The Roman diet was heavily influenced by the Mediterranean climate and the empire's vast territories. The main foods were grains, especially wheat, which was used to make bread. Romans also ate a lot of vegetables, legumes, beans and lentils, and fruits, both fresh and dried. Meat was something that only the rich could buy, and only on special occasions. But fish and seafood were common, especially in coastal areas. One of the most interesting things about Roman food was the use of garum, a fermented fish sauce that the Romans used to make food taste better, similar to how we use salt today. Making this sauce was a big business in many Roman towns. But it smelt so strongly that factories were often built on the edge of towns. The Romans are perhaps best known for the toga, a large woolen garment that was wrapped around the body. The toga is a symbol of Roman citizenship, but it was usually only worn for formal events because it was so bulky. Every day, most Romans, both men and women, wore a simple tunic. The quality and decoration of the tunic often showed what social class the person was. For example, senators wore tunics with a wide purple stripe, while equestrians, members of the lower aristocracy, wore a narrower stripe. The Romans also liked jewelry. Both men and women wore rings, bracelets, necklaces, and earrings. Richer Romans often wore gold jewelry set with precious gems, while those with less money wore pieces made from cheaper materials. The Romans loved a good show. The Colosseum, perhaps the most famous building from this time, was used for gladiator fights, fake sea battles, and other shows for the public. Theater was another popular form of entertainment, with comedies being particularly well-liked. Most towns and cities in the empire had a theater, and performances were often part of religious festivals. Trade was a vital part of life in the Roman Empire, with goods coming in from all over the empire. The marketplace, or forum, was the center of commercial life. Here, merchants sold all kinds of things from food and clothing to exotic goods from faraway lands. The Romans also built a great road system to help with trade and military movements. During this time in Roman history, society was full of contrasts and different types of people, from the fancy homes of rich people to the small apartments of poor people. The Roman Empire was a complex and vibrant world, with the rich and powerful eating sumptuous feasts and ordinary people eating simple meals. As we learn more about this exciting time, we will look in more detail at what daily life was like, the cultural practices and the social structures of the Roman Empire when it was at its most powerful. So, close your eyes and imagine the busy streets of ancient Rome. As we learn more about the Roman Empire, we explore busy city centers and find out what daily life was like for ordinary Romans. The typical Roman city was an amazing piece of engineering. It had well-paved roads, clever sewage systems, and impressive structures made of brick and stone. One of the most famous buildings, the amphitheater, was the center of Roman social life. Citizens would gather there to watch public shows and games. These huge arenas could hold thousands of spectators and were amazing buildings for their time. The Roman home was another important part of Roman life. The building was more than just a physical structure. It was a social unit that included the head of the household, his wife, children, and slaves. The rich Romans lived in beautiful houses in the city, which were decorated with mosaics, paintings, and statues. These homes had many rooms, including a dining room, bedrooms, a kitchen, and often a small garden. The poor people lived in very crowded apartment buildings called insulae. These were often badly built and easily caught fire. Life in the Roman Empire was divided into different levels, and your social status had a big effect on how good your life was. The most important people in society were the patricians, the rich and powerful aristocrats. Below them were the ordinary people. Slaves were at the bottom of the social order. Despite the big differences in how people lived, all Romans, no matter what their status, enjoyed certain public amenities like public baths, forums, and amphitheaters. Roman food was very similar to food from the Mediterranean region. Olives, grapes, and wheat were the main ingredients in Roman food. The rich Romans ate exotic foods like peacock tongues and dormice, while ordinary people ate simple meals of bread, porridge, and vegetables. Everyone drank wine, even people who didn't have much money. They often added water to make it weaker. The Romans were a deeply religious people. They had many gods and goddesses. They worshipped them in temples and shrines. They believed that their city was divine and that their military success and prosperity came from the gods' favor. Religion was closely connected to the state, and the emperor was often treated like a god. Education was very important in Roman society. Wealthy children were taught at home by private teachers. They studied subjects like rhetoric, philosophy, and mathematics. But poorer children often didn't get the chance to go to school and instead learned how to do different jobs from their parents. Even so, more people in the Roman Empire could read than in other ancient civilizations. Roman law was a complicated system that was built up over many years, based on older laws that had been used in the past. Roman law had a big impact on many other legal systems that came after it, and lots of the things it said are still used in law today. The Romans were among the first to say that a person is innocent until proven guilty. Roman society was also known for its love of leisure and entertainment. The Romans loved big shows like gladiator fights and chariot races in huge arenas like the Colosseum. Theater and music were also popular forms of entertainment. Many Romans played musical instruments and went to plays in their free time. In the Roman Empire, life was a mix of luxury and hard work, of big shows and simple pleasures. It was a society that was full of new ideas, loved a good show, and had very clear social rules. Despite the many challenges and inequalities, the people of Rome built a civilization that has had a very big impact on history. As we carry on exploring the Roman Empire, we learn more about the lives of the Romans, including what they hoped for, their dreams, and the challenges they faced every day. As we learn more about daily life in the Roman Empire, we discover more about education and learning. The Romans, like us today, knew how important it was to get a good education. But the way they were taught and what they were taught was very different from how we think about school today. Let's imagine what it was like for a Roman child to learn and grow during the Roman Empire's golden age. In the early morning, the Roman child, usually a boy, will be sent to the home of a literator or reading and writing teacher. Girls were not completely kept out of education, but often received a less structured, less extensive education at home, focusing mainly on domestic skills. The literator would teach children the basics of reading and writing in Latin, the language spoken throughout the empire. This education was not free, and the cost would depend on the teacher's reputation. The teacher's room would be filled with the sound of children practicing their lessons. This is very different from the quiet, individual study we usually think of when we think of modern classrooms. After learning the basics, the child would then go to a grammaticus, who was a teacher of grammar and literature. Here, the child would read the works of famous Roman and Greek writers, learning about their culture and morals. The child would also learn to write in Greek, as being able to speak two languages was thought to be very important in Roman society. The grammaticus would also teach rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking, a skill that was highly valued in a society where public speaking was very important. If the family could afford it, the final stage of education would be a course in rhetoric and philosophy. This was like a university education today, and it got the student ready for a job in politics and law, which are the most important jobs in Roman society. But the intellectual life of the Roman Empire was not just about formal education. The Romans really liked Greek culture and thought it was smart. They took a lot of it and used it to make their own culture better. Libraries, both public and private, were common and full of scrolls containing the works of great Greek and Roman thinkers. There are also public lectures and debates where the educated elite would gather to discuss philosophical and ethical issues. Even though the Roman education system focused on learning, some people did not like it. Some Romans were sad about the focus on Greek culture and language, believing it took away from traditional Roman values. People also criticized the harsh discipline in Roman schools, where corporal punishment was common. But whether you loved or loathed the Roman education system, it is clear that it was a very important part of life during the Roman Empire's peak. It had a big effect on how Roman citizens thought and what they believed in, and this could be seen in everything from politics to literature. It might seem strange to us because it focuses on learning by heart and physical discipline, but it is actually the foundation of our own education system. As we move away from the busy classrooms and quiet libraries of ancient Rome, we find ourselves standing at the door of a Roman home, ready to explore the private world of family life. But that's a story for another time. For now, let's close our eyes and imagine the voices of Roman children as they recite their lessons. The sound of parchment scrolls rustling in a library and lively discussions happening in a public lecture. These images will help you to relax and think about the past. As we carry on our journey through the Roman Empire, we find ourselves in a busy marketplace. Markets, or mela as they were known in Latin, were a very important part of Roman life. They were the center of the economy and society. These were not just places for buying and selling, but also places where people talked about news, politics, and made friends. The marketplace was full of stalls, sellers, and people shopping. It was normal for farmers to sell their produce directly to the public. You could also see fishermen selling their fresh catches and bakers selling bread that had just been baked. Other sellers sold things like clothes, pottery, things for the home, and even slaves. The market was filled with people talking excitedly and the sound of coins being thrown in. A foreigner might find the market chaotic, but for the Romans, it was a well-organized noise, a dance they were used to. The Roman diet was simple but healthy. The main food was grain, which was ground into flour and baked into bread. Olive oil and wine were also staples. The Romans ate lots of different fruits and vegetables like apples, pears, cherries, onions, leeks, lentils, and beans. Meat was something to be enjoyed only on special occasions. The Romans also really liked fish and seafood, which were easy to find because of the empire's long coastline. As the sun went down, the market would slowly become empty, but the center of Roman social life did not stop. The evening was a time to relax and have fun. The Romans loved theater, especially comedy. People would sit outside in big theaters to watch plays and eat snacks. But the most popular kind of entertainment was definitely the gladiator games. These were violent shows where gladiators, who were usually slaves or criminals, fought each other or wild animals to the death. Even though these games were very violent, they were still very popular and attracted large crowds. The crowd roared, weapons clashed, and drama unfolded as people battled for their lives in the arena. This was the kind of show the Romans loved. But the Romans were not just about blood and spectacle. They were also very interested in education and philosophy. Schools were common throughout the empire where children learned reading, writing, arithmetic, and rhetoric. The Romans really liked Greek culture and philosophy, too. Many Romans studied the works of Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. The Romans also had a very clever legal system. They believed in the rule of law and justice. The 12 Tables, the earliest set of Roman laws, set out the legal rights and responsibilities of citizens. The laws covered lots of different topics, from property rights to criminal law. The Romans also had a system of courts and judges to enforce the law. As the day ended, the Romans would go back to their homes, which were very different depending on how rich they were. The poor lived in very small apartments in buildings with many floors called insulae. These buildings were often badly built and easily caught fire. The rich people lived in big, fancy houses with big rooms, pretty mosaics, and beautiful gardens. As we leave the busy streets and go into the quiet of the night, we can think about how full of life Roman life was at its best. It was a time of plenty and growth, but also of great inequality and violence. But despite these problems, it was a society that had a very big effect on world history. As we drift off to sleep, we are still influenced by the Roman Empire a civilization that continues to fascinate and inspire us. In the last section, we finished our trip through the busy markets of ancient Rome, smelling the strong smell of spices, herbs, and olives, and listening to the noisy sound of coins, bargaining, and the many languages spoken by the different people there. Now, let's look at the Roman Empire, its government, and politics. When Rome was at its strongest, it was like a republic in name only. The government was controlled by a number of powerful families known as patricians, who held most of the political power. These families often had strong connections to Roman society, going back to the city's earliest days. Despite having so much power, the Romans were very proud of their republican beliefs. They even elected 2 consuls every year to run the country. The consuls were the most senior officials in the government, who shared the power to make decisions. They were chosen from among the senators, a group of about 300 men who were the real power behind the Roman government. The Senate was the main group that made laws and decisions about war and peace. Senators were also responsible for electing the consuls. This often led to intense political rivalries and even bloodshed. As well as the consuls and the Senate, there were several other important positions in the Roman government. These included the prefects, who were judges, the aediles, who were in charge of public buildings and festivals, the cairs, who managed the state treasury, and the censors, who were responsible for the census and maintaining the state's moral standards. To balance the power of the patrician class, there were also institutions that allowed the participation of the common people or plebeians in the Roman government. The ordinary people could elect their own officials, known as tribunes, who had the power to veto the decisions of the Senate. This was an important protection against the patricians, the rich and powerful, ruling alone, and it allowed for a kind of democracy in the Roman Republic. Despite the fact that the Roman government was democratic, it was rife with corruption. Elections were often fixed, and bribery was common. Rich people could buy political offices, and politicians often used their positions to make a lot of money. This corruption was one of the things that led to the Roman Republic falling and the Roman Empire rising. In the late Republic, there were a lot of civil wars and political crises. This led to Julius Caesar becoming dictator. After he was killed, his adopted son, Octavian, later known as Augustus, became the first Roman emperor. This marked the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. During the empire, the Senate lost a lot of its power and became more of a symbol. The emperor had complete control, making all the big decisions and running the army. But the emperors made it seem like they were still a republic, with the Senate and other institutions still doing their jobs, even though they had a lot less power. This was the political structure that governed the vast Roman Empire, from the north of Britain to the south of Egypt, and from the west of Spain to the east of Syria. It was a complicated and often dishonest system, but it managed to keep control of a huge and varied area for many centuries. As we learn more about the Roman Empire, we can start to understand the complex relationship between power and politics. This helped make Rome one of the most interesting civilizations in history. In the next section, we will explore what an average Roman citizen's life was like. From ordinary people to rich aristocrats, come with me and experience what life was like in the Roman Empire. In the middle of the Roman Empire, the city of Rome itself was an amazing sight to see. In the 6th chapter of our journey through life in the Roman Empire during its peak, we will look at the urban landscape and the amazing architecture that still inspires us today. Rome was a city like no other in the ancient world. It was huge, spread out, and full of people, almost 1 million of them. The city was divided into neighborhoods, or vici, each with its own local officials and responsibilities. These neighborhoods were a mixture of homes, businesses, and public buildings, all mixed together in a way that would be familiar to anyone living in a modern city. The homes of the rich were very fancy and comfortable. They were often built around a central courtyard or atrium. This was like the heart of the house. There were different rooms off this atrium, like dining rooms, bedrooms, and private bathrooms. The homes were decorated with detailed mosaics, bright fresco paintings, and other art that showed the owner's wealth and status. Despite the grandeur of these domes, most people lived in apartment buildings or insulae. These buildings could be several stories high and were often cramped and poorly constructed. In fact, fires were common in the island, and sometimes buildings collapsed because they were poorly built or not looked after. Even so, most people in Rome had homes that were insulated. Another thing that made the Roman cityscape so unique were its public buildings. The most famous of these was the Colosseum, which was built during the reign of Emperor Vespasian and could hold up to 50,000 spectators. This amphitheater was used for gladiatorial games, animal hunts, and even mock naval battles. Other public buildings included the Circus Maximus, a chariot racing stadium that could hold up to 150,000 spectators, and the Roman Forum, which was the political and economic heart of the city. The city of Rome also had a big network of aqueducts, which brought fresh water from faraway places into the city. These aqueducts, some of which are still standing today, show how skilled the Romans were at engineering. The water from these aqueducts was used in public baths, fountains, and even in some private homes. Public baths, or thermae, were a central part of Roman social life. These places were more than just places to bathe. They were also places where you could exercise, relax, and meet other people. They were often grand structures complete with hot and cold bathing rooms, swimming pools, and even libraries. The cleanliness and well-being of the city's residents were important issues. The Romans built a big sewer system called the Cloaca Maxima. It took waste from the city to the Tiber River. They also made sure there was enough food and stopped diseases spreading. This included getting public doctors and setting up grain storage places. As we walk through the old streets of Rome, we are amazed by how grand the city is. It's a place where rich people lived in opulent homes and ordinary people struggled to make a living. This is where Roman engineering was at its best, as seen in everyday life, and where you can still hear the past in every stone and every corner. As we go to sleep, let's picture the ancient city of Rome and imagine what life was like there. A city of dreamers, builders, artists, and warriors. A city that shows how great humanity can be. When the Roman Empire was at its most powerful, the streets of Rome started to be full of people and activity. Trade was the lifeblood of this growing society, and the city's markets were always full of people selling everything from fresh food and animals to fancy silks and spices brought in from the east. The empire had lots of good roads and sea routes. These meant that it was easy to transport goods from the farthest parts of the empire to the center of Rome. This helped Rome become a global trade hub. The daily life of a Roman citizen was largely dictated by their social status. The rich and powerful members of the Roman elite lived in a world of extreme luxury. They lived in grand villas with beautiful frescoes and mosaics, often on large estates outside the city. These homes showed how rich and powerful their owners were. They often had big parties where guests drank expensive wine and watched entertainment. The ordinary people, the common folk, lived in very small apartments called insulae in the center of the city. Even though they didn't have much, the poor Romans were very proud of their community and took part in public life. They would often visit the city's many baths, markets, and amphitheaters, enjoying the many public entertainments the empire had to offer. The Roman Empire was famous for its public amenities, many of which were the first of their kind. The city had a big water supply system, which provided clean water to public fountains, baths, and people's homes. The Roman baths were amazing constructions and a place where people met and socialized. People of all classes would gather here to wash, socialize, and talk about politics. The baths were often impressive buildings. They had heated floors, steam rooms, and large pools filled with mineral-rich water. Education was also very important in Roman society. Although formal schooling was not supported by the government or compulsory, many Roman parents paid for private teachers to educate their children. Learning was really important in Roman times. Children were taught to read, write, and speak well in Latin and often Greek. They were also taught philosophy, music, mathematics, and astronomy, showing that the empire thought these subjects were very important. Religion was a big part of what Romans did every day. They worshipped many gods and goddesses, each with their own special powers and areas of responsibility. The Romans were very superstitious. They thought that by praying, sacrificing, and performing rituals, they could make the gods like them. Temples dedicated to these gods were found all around the city. They were places where people went to worship and to meet with their community. The Roman legal system was very advanced for the time. People were presumed innocent until proven guilty, and they had the right to defend themselves in court. However, the courts often favored the rich and powerful, and there was a lot of corruption. When the sun set, the Roman nightlife started. People would go to pubs and inns to get food and drink and meet other people. Street performers would put on shows for people walking by. They would play music, do dances, and put on short plays. The city's amphitheaters were the sites of gladiator fights, chariot races, and theater performances, drawing crowds of thousands. Even though there were a lot of problems and inequalities, life during the Roman Empire's peak was full of life and opportunities. It was a time when people's thinking grew, new ideas about buildings appeared, and people from different cultures shared ideas. It was an era where a normal person could become a respected senator, and where the achievements of individuals and society as a whole were celebrated. The Roman Empire was a great example of how well humanity can do when we work together. As we drift off to sleep tonight, let's imagine the busy streets of Rome, its impressive buildings and lively people, and dream of a time when Rome was the heart of the vault.